Sarah Thompson's hands trembled as she watched another nanny walk out of her front door. This was the fifth one in 6 months, and she felt her world crumbling around her. Standing in her modern suburban home's entryway, the 34-year-old single mother fought back tears as she clutched her son's favorite stuffed dinosaur. As a corporate lawyer at one of Boston's most prestigious firms, Sarah had everything society deemed successful: a beautiful house in a safe neighborhood, a high-paying career, and a healthy 4-year-old son named Marcus. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The pattern of nannies quitting had become more than just an inconvenience. It was now a frightening mystery. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but I can't continue working here," Janet, the latest nanny, had said just moments ago. Like the others before her, she offered no concrete explanation, just vague mentions of the job being too difficult and not what she expected. Sarah had noticed the slight tremor in Janet's voice and the way her eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something unseen. Marcus sat on the stairs, his big brown eyes watching the scene unfold. He looked perfectly innocent, playing with his toy cars and occasionally making vrooming sounds. Sarah couldn't understand it. Her son was well-behaved, polite, and generally easy to manage. She'd never seen him throw tantrums or display any concerning behavior that would drive nannies away. The first nanny, Elizabeth, had lasted 3 months. She'd left claiming a family emergency, but Sarah later discovered she'd taken another job immediately afterward. The second lasted 6 weeks, the third barely a month, and the fourth just 2 weeks. Now Janet, who'd seemed so promising during the interview, had barely made it through 10 days. Sarah walked to her home office, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. She'd have to call the nanny agency again, but first, she needed a moment to think. The large window behind her desk overlooked their well-maintained backyard, where Marcus's swing set stood unused in the afternoon sun. She'd invested in it hoping the nannies would take him outside to play, but lately, they'd all seemed reluctant to spend time in the backyard. Opening her laptop, Sarah began reviewing the notes she kept about each nanny's departure. There had to be a pattern, something she was missing. Elizabeth had mentioned feeling watched. Maria, the second nanny, complained about items moving around the house. Sandra, the third, spoke about cold spots and strange noises. Ashley, the fourth, had simply left a note saying she couldn't handle it anymore. And now Janet, who'd practically run out the door. All of them had been highly qualified, with excellent references and years of experience. Sarah paid above market rate, offered health benefits, and provided a flexible schedule. The house was equipped with every modern convenience, and Marcus's routine was well structured. On paper, this should have been a dream position for any professional nanny. "Mommy?" Marcus's small voice startled her from her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, clutching his dinosaur, looking smaller than his 4 years. "Yes, sweetheart?" Sarah tried to keep her voice steady, not wanting him to sense her distress. "Is Janet coming back tomorrow?" The innocence of his question broke her heart. "No, honey, but we'll find someone new to play with you while Mommy's at work." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's okay, they never stay anyway." Something about his matter-of-fact tone sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The way he said it, as if he expected this outcome, made her wonder if there was more to these departures than she realized. Sarah pulled out her phone and called her office, requesting to work from home for the rest of the week. She needed time to figure this out. As she hung up, she noticed Marcus had wandered to the living room window, where he appeared to be waving at something, or someone. But when Sarah looked out, she saw only their empty front yard. That night, after tucking Marcus into bed, Sarah sat in her kitchen with a glass of wine, scrolling through security camera companies on her phone. Something was happening in her house, and she was determined to find out what. Little did she know, the truth would be far more shocking than anything she could imagine. The next morning, Sarah woke up early to review her notes before Marcus got up. She had spent half the night making phone calls to each of the previous nannies, leaving voicemails that went unanswered. The silence from all of them only deepened her concern. While preparing Marcus's breakfast, she noticed something odd. The kitchen chairs, which she'd always tucked neatly under the table before bed, were pulled out at different angles. She distinctly remembered arranging them properly the night before. It had become a habit, a small way of maintaining order in her increasingly chaotic life. "Marcus, breakfast is ready." She called up the stairs. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway brought a smile to her face, despite her worries. Her son appeared in his favorite dinosaur pajamas, but something about his expression made her pause. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes that no 4-year-old should have. "Didn't you sleep well, sweetie?" Sarah asked, placing a bowl of cereal in front of him. Marcus shrugged, pushing the cereal around with his spoon. The lady was singing again. Sarah froze. "What lady, Marcus?" "The one who comes at night. She sings old songs." He said it so casually, as if discussing the weather. Janet didn't like her singing. That's why she left. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. This was the first time Marcus had mentioned anything about a singing lady. She sat down across from him, trying to keep her voice steady. "Has this lady been here before? When the other nannies were here too?" Marcus nodded, taking a small bite of cereal. "She's always here. Sometimes she reads me stories. The nannies don't like it when she does that." Sarah's mind raced. Was this an imaginary friend? Children his age often created them, but something about this felt different. The way the nannies had acted, their reluctance to explain their departures. Could they have experienced something too? Later that morning, while Marcus played with his toys in the living room, Sarah decided to examine the house more carefully. She started in the kitchen, where the chairs had been moved, and worked her way through each room. In Marcus's bedroom, she noticed his bookshelf had been rearranged. The picture books were now organized by size, something she hadn't done. As she stood there puzzling over the books, a blast of cold air hit her. The window was closed, and the air conditioning wasn't running. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, watching as her breath formed a small cloud in the suddenly frigid room. From downstairs, she heard Marcus laughing. Not his usual laugh, but the kind of giggle he reserved for when he was sharing a secret with someone. Sarah hurried down the stairs, her heart pounding. Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor, looking up at an empty corner of the room. "That's a funny story," he said to the apparent emptiness. "Can you tell another one?" "Marcus," Sarah said softly, "who are you talking to?" He turned to her with bright eyes. "The nice lady. She's telling me stories about when she used to take care of other children here, a long time ago." Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. It was an email from the real estate agent who had handled her house purchase a year ago. She had contacted him last night, asking about the home's history. The email was brief but disturbing. Before Sarah bought the house, it had belonged to the Williams family for over 50 years. Their elderly mother, Margaret Williams, had been a nanny to 3 generations of children in the neighborhood. She had lived in the house until her death 10 years ago. According to the agent, Margaret had been beloved by all the children she cared for, known for her gentle singing voice and storytelling abilities. She had passed away in what was now Marcus's bedroom, reading a bedtime story to her last charge. Sarah looked at her son, still chatting happily with the empty corner. The temperature in the room had dropped even further, and she could have sworn she heard the faintest whisper of an old lullaby. That evening, Sarah made 2 decisions. First, she would install security cameras throughout the house. Second, she would start looking into the history of Margaret Williams. Something told her that understanding the past was the key to making sense of their present situation. The security company arrived early the next morning to install cameras throughout the house. Sarah had chosen a high-end system with night vision capabilities and motion sensors. As the technicians worked, she noticed they kept giving each other strange looks, especially when working in Marcus's room. "Ma'am," one of the technicians said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool temperature, "is your heating system malfunctioning? This room is freezing." Sarah shook her head. "The heating works fine. It's just, this room gets cold sometimes." While the installation continued, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, researching Margaret Williams on her laptop. Local newspaper archives revealed more about the former nanny. Margaret had never married, dedicating her life to caring for children. Her obituary was filled with loving tributes from families whose lives she had touched. One particular article caught Sarah's attention. It described how Margaret had saved a child from choking in 1985. The mother had come home to find Margaret performing the Heimlich maneuver on her 3-year-old son. After that incident, families trusted her even more, seeing her as not just a nanny but a guardian angel. "All done, Mrs. Thompson," the lead technician announced, handing her a tablet. "You can monitor all cameras from this device. We've installed 12 cameras covering every room in the hallways. The system will alert you if it detects any unusual movement or temperature changes. Sarah thanked them and spent the next hour learning to use the system. Marcus was at his weekly playgroup, giving her time to prepare for what she might see. The cameras offered crystal clear views of every space, including thermal imaging options. That afternoon, she received a call from Rebecca, the fifth nanny who had quit. Unlike the others, Rebecca sounded willing to talk. "I saw your message," Rebecca said, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been trying to forget what happened, but maybe you need to know." Sarah pressed the phone closer to her ear. "Please tell me everything." Rebecca took a deep breath. It started with the singing. At first, I thought it was a radio somewhere, old lullabies playing softly. Then I noticed things moving, books rearranging themselves, toys appearing in different places. But what really scared me was the rocking chair. The rocking chair? Sarah glanced at the antique chair in Marcus's room, another item left behind by the previous owners. Yes, one night, I went to check on Marcus, and it was rocking by itself. But that wasn't the worst part. I saw her, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman sitting in the chair, stroking Marcus's hair as he slept. When she turned to look at me, Rebecca's voice cracked. Her eyes were so sad, like she was disappointed I was interrupting them. Sarah remembered how Marcus had mentioned the lady who sang to him. "Did you feel threatened?" "No," Rebecca replied thoughtfully. "She never felt dangerous. It was more like she was checking to make sure we were taking good care of Marcus. But I couldn't handle it. The constant feeling of being watched, being judged by someone who wasn't supposed to be there." After ending the call, Sarah sat in silence, processing everything. The cameras were now her best hope of understanding what was happening in her home. She pulled up the tablet and watched Marcus playing in his room, returned from his playgroup. Suddenly, the tablet beeped. The temperature in Marcus's room had dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Sarah watched, transfixed, as the rocking chair began to move slowly back and forth. Marcus looked up and smiled at something she couldn't see. The tablet beeped again. A figure was taking shape in the thermal imaging, a cold spot in the shape of a person, sitting in the rocking chair. As Sarah stared at the screen, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I found something about Margaret Williams you need to see. Meet me at the local library tomorrow. Rebecca." Sarah looked back at the thermal image, where the cold spot was now leaning over Marcus as he played with his toys. Whatever was happening in her house, she was finally getting closer to the truth. The question was, once she knew everything, what would she do about it? Sarah arrived at the local library early the next morning, having dropped Marcus off at his playgroup. She found Rebecca sitting at a corner table, surrounded by old newspapers and photographs. The former nanny looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "Thank you for coming," Rebecca said, sliding a yellowed newspaper article across the table. "Look at this photo from 1975. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The black and white photograph showed a group of children playing in what was unmistakably her backyard. Behind them stood Margaret Williams, looking exactly as she appeared in the thermal imaging, a tall, slender woman with her hair in a neat bun, wearing a long dress. "But that's not the important part," Rebecca said, pulling out another article dated 1992. "Read this." The article described a tragic incident where Margaret had prevented a kidnapping attempt. A man had tried to take one of her charges, a 5-year-old girl, but Margaret had confronted him. The would-be kidnapper had fled, and the police later caught him. He turned out to be wanted for similar attempts in other states. She wasn't just a nanny, Rebecca explained. She was a protector. Every child in her care was safe, always. That's why she's still there. Sarah's phone buzzed. The security system was sending alerts from her house. The babysitter she'd hired to watch Marcus after playgroup was reporting strange occurrences. Sarah opened the live feed on her phone. The cameras showed Marcus in the living room with the babysitter, Amy. Everything looked normal until the temperature reading suddenly plummeted. Amy was looking around nervously, clearly sensing something wrong. Marcus, however, was smiling and waving at the empty space near the window. "Watch," Rebecca said, leaning over to see the phone screen. "The thermal imaging will show you." Sure enough, the cold spot appeared again, this time moving between Marcus and Amy. The babysitter shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. The thermal image showed the distinct outline of a person standing guard-like between them. "She's checking Amy," Rebecca explained. "Margaret does this with everyone who comes to care for Marcus. That's why the nannies left. She was evaluating us, and somehow we all failed her standards." Sarah remembered how Marcus had said the lady didn't like some of the nannies. But why didn't she frighten Marcus? "Children are more accepting of these things," Rebecca said. "Plus, Margaret would never scare a child. She's still doing what she always did, protecting children in that house." As they watched, Amy on the screen became increasingly agitated. She was now gathering her things, making a phone call, presumably to Sarah. Right on cue, Sarah's phone rang. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry, but I can't stay here." Amy's frightened voice came through. "Something's not right. The room keeps getting cold, and I keep hearing humming, and—" "It's okay, Amy," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her calmness. "I'll be home in 15 minutes. You can leave once I get there." After ending the call, Sarah turned to Rebecca. "What do I do now? I can't keep hiring babysitters just to have them quit." Rebecca pulled out one final document, a handwritten letter. This was Margaret's last letter to the Williams family before she died. She wrote about how her greatest joy was keeping children safe, and how she wished she could continue doing it forever. Rebecca paused. "I think, in her own way, she is." Sarah gathered the articles, her mind racing. She had two choices. She could move and try to escape whatever was happening, or she could accept that her son had an unusual but devoted guardian. On her phone, the thermal imaging showed Margaret's figure now sitting in the rocking chair, Marcus at her feet playing contentedly while Amy waited nervously by the door. The scene was both eerie and oddly comforting. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "I need to have a conversation with Margaret." Rebecca nodded. "Just remember, she was known for her kindness, but also for her high standards. If you want her to accept you and any future caregivers, you'll need to understand what she's looking for." Sarah gathered her things, preparing to head home. She had never expected to be negotiating childcare arrangements with a ghost, but then again, how many children had the privilege of being watched over by someone who had dedicated both life and afterlife to protecting them? That evening, after Marcus had gone to bed, Sarah sat in the living room with all the lights dimmed. The security tablet rested on her lap, showing thermal readings of the house. She had placed Margaret's old photograph on the coffee table along with a cup of tea, made exactly how the former nanny had preferred it, according to the old articles. "Margaret," Sarah spoke softly into the quiet room, "I know you're here. I know you're watching over Marcus, and I want to thank you for that." The room's temperature began to drop. On the tablet, Sarah watched as a cold spot formed in the armchair across from her. The thermal imaging showed the distinct outline of a woman sitting properly, hands folded in her lap. "I understand now," Sarah continued, trying to keep her voice steady. "You've been testing the nannies, making sure they were good enough for Marcus, just like you protected all those other children years ago." A gentle humming filled the room, one of the old lullabies Marcus had mentioned. The sound was faint but clear, like a distant music box. The teacup on the table moved slightly, and Sarah watched in amazement as ripples appeared in the liquid. "I'm a single mother, Margaret. I need help caring for Marcus while I work. But I need to know, what are you looking for? What makes someone good enough to care for him?" The thermal imaging shifted as the figure stood up. Sarah watched as Margaret's form moved to the mantel where family photos were displayed. One photo, showing Marcus on his 4th birthday, suddenly tilted forward. Sarah stood and walked to the mantel. Behind the tilted photo, she found an old envelope that she had never noticed before. Inside was a yellowed piece of paper covered in elegant handwriting. "My Principles of Childcare," the heading read. It was Margaret's personal manifesto, written decades ago. As Sarah read through it, she began to understand. Margaret's rules were simple but strict. Never raise your voice to a child. Always listen to their stories. Make time for play and imagination. Keep them safe at all costs. And most importantly, love them as if they were your own. The temperature in the room warmed slightly, as if in approval of Sarah's discovery. The security tablet beeped, showing Margaret's form now standing beside her. "You want someone who will follow these principles," Sarah said aloud. "Someone who will care for Marcus the way you cared for children." A gentle breeze ruffled the paper in her hands, a response that felt like yes. Sarah thought about all the nannies who had quit. Had they been too busy with their phones to listen to Marcus's stories? Had they rushed through playtime? Had they shown impatience when he wanted to talk about his imaginary friend? I have an idea, Sarah said, reaching for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Mrs. Chen was an elderly woman who lived down the street. She had often stopped to talk with Marcus when they went for walks, always taking time to listen to his elaborate dinosaur stories. Sarah had noticed how patient and gentle she was, reminding her of the way Margaret was described in the old articles. As Sarah dialed the number, the room grew noticeably warmer. The thermal imaging showed Margaret's form returning to the armchair, a posture that somehow conveyed approval. "Hello, Mrs. Chen? This is Sarah Thompson, Marcus's mother. I was wondering if you might be interested in helping me with Marcus during the day." As Sarah discussed the details with Mrs. Chen, she noticed something remarkable on the security feed. The thermal imaging showed Margaret's figure nodding, and for the first time, Sarah could make out what looked like a smile on the ghostly form. Later that night, as Sarah checked on Marcus one last time, she found him sleeping peacefully. The rocking chair moved gently, and the room was comfortably cool, not the harsh cold that had frightened the other caregivers. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the presence she could now feel but not see. "Thank you for watching over him. Mrs. Chen will start next week, and I think you'll find she meets your standards." As she closed the door, Sarah heard the faint sound of Margaret's lullaby and knew that her son was in the best possible care, with a guardian angel who had dedicated eternity to keeping him safe. Mrs. Chen's first day began with an unusual welcome. When she arrived at the Thompson house early Monday morning, the front door opened before she could ring the bell. Inside, she found Sarah waiting with Marcus, and a peculiar warmth filled the usually cool house. "The nice lady likes you," Marcus announced cheerfully, hugging Mrs. Chen's legs. "She told me so last night." Mrs. Chen simply smiled, patting Marcus's head. Unlike the previous caregivers, she showed no surprise at his comment. Sarah watched as the elderly woman set down her bag and pulled out a worn book of children's stories, the same edition Margaret had used decades ago, Sarah noticed. "My mother was friends with Margaret Williams," Mrs. Chen revealed as she settled into the living room. "They used to exchange childcare advice. I learned a lot from watching her with the neighborhood children." Sarah's eyes widened at this unexpected connection. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Some things," Mrs. Chen said wisely, "need the right moment to be revealed. Margaret was very particular about who cared for her children. I assume she still is." The security tablet on the coffee table showed the thermal imaging of two distinct figures, Mrs. Chen in her warm tones, and beside her, the cool outline of Margaret, both seated on the couch. The temperature in the room remained comfortable, nothing like the hostile cold that had driven away the previous nannies. Throughout the day, Sarah watched the security feeds from her office. She observed as Mrs. Chen followed Margaret's childcare principles perfectly, though she had never seen the written list. When Marcus told stories, she listened intently. During playtime, she fully engaged in his games. At lunch, she cut his sandwich into dinosaur shapes, just as Margaret used to do for her charges. Most remarkably, whenever the thermal imaging showed Margaret's presence, Mrs. Chen would unconsciously shift to make space, as if somehow sensing the spiritual guardian. She would turn her head slightly when Margaret's form appeared near Marcus, acknowledging the shared duty of caring for the boy. That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected email from the Historical Society. They had found additional information about Margaret Williams, including a diary from her last years. The entry from her final day was particularly moving. "Children need more than just supervision. They need love, patience, and someone who understands that childhood is a precious time of wonder. I pray that even after I'm gone, the children in this house will always have someone to watch over them with the same dedication I tried to show." Sarah glanced at her security tablet. The thermal imaging showed a remarkable scene. Marcus sitting on the floor with his toys, Mrs. Chen in the rocking chair reading a story, and Margaret's cool outline standing guard by the window. 3 generations of caregivers working in perfect harmony. That evening, after Mrs. Chen left, Sarah found Marcus humming one of Margaret's lullabies while drawing a picture. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" she asked. Marcus held up his artwork proudly. "It's Mrs. Chen and the nice lady playing with me. Look, They're both smiling. The crayon drawing showed three figures: a small boy, an elderly Asian woman, and a tall figure in a long dress. What struck Sarah was how accurately Marcus had captured Margaret's appearance, down to the neat bun and gentle expression, though he had only ever seen her spirit. As Sarah hung the drawing on the refrigerator, the security tablet showed Margaret's form approaching. The temperature shifted, not cold but comfortably cool, like a gentle breeze on a warm day. For the first time, Sarah felt she could almost see what Marcus saw, not a ghost to be feared, but a dedicated caregiver whose love for children transcended even death. "I think," Sarah said to the presence she was growing to trust, "we finally found the right balance. Mrs. Chen understands your principles, and together, you'll give Marcus the care he deserves." The security system recorded a unique event that night. All three figures, Sarah, Marcus, and Mrs. Chen's information, were labeled as approved caregivers in Margaret's section of the house. The ghost nanny had finally found her perfect team, and the Thompson house felt more like a home than ever before. As weeks passed, the Thompson household settled into a comfortable routine. Mrs. Chen arrived each morning, greeted by both Marcus and the gentle presence of Margaret. The security cameras continued to show the harmonious interaction between the living and spiritual caregivers, but now Sarah noticed something new developing. Margaret's presence was becoming more visible, not just on the thermal imaging, but in subtle ways throughout the house. The elderly neighbors who came to visit would often pause, smiling faintly as they passed certain spots in the house. Some would comment about how the place reminded them of their childhood days when Margaret had cared for them. One rainy afternoon, while Sarah worked from home, she heard laughter coming from Marcus's room. Through the security feed, she watched an extraordinary scene unfold. Mrs. Chen was teaching Marcus to knit, a skill Margaret had been famous for, while the thermal imaging showed Margaret's form completing the circle around Marcus's small table. "My grandmother taught me to knit," Mrs. Chen was saying, "but I learned this particular pattern from Margaret Williams herself. She used to make sweaters for all her children." Marcus looked up at the empty space where Margaret's form showed on the thermal imaging. "Can you show me how to make a dinosaur sweater?" he asked, addressing both his caregivers at once. The security tablet captured a remarkable moment. Both Mrs. Chen's and Margaret's forms reached for the yarn simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized as if they had planned it. That evening, Sarah received a call from the Historical Society. They had discovered a trunk full of Margaret's belongings in their archives, including dozens of hand-knitted sweaters and detailed journals about the children she had cared for. "There's something else," the historian said. "We found her will. She left specific instructions about the house and its future occupants." Sarah drove to the Historical Society the next day during her lunch break. The will was fascinating. Margaret had stipulated that the house should always go to families with children, particularly those who might need extra care and protection. She believed that being a caregiver was a sacred duty, the historian explained, showing Sarah more documents. These journals detail how she developed her childcare principles over 50 years of experience. When Sarah returned home, she found Mrs. Chen and Marcus in the garden, planting flowers in what used to be Margaret's herb garden. The thermal imaging showed Margaret's form moving between the flower beds, her presence causing the flowers to sway gently despite the still air. "These were her favorite flowers," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to the lily bulbs they were planting. "She always said that a garden teaches children about patience and nurturing." That night, after Marcus was asleep, Sarah sat in the living room with Margaret's journals spread around her. As she read through them, she began to understand the depth of Margaret's dedication. The journals weren't just about childcare routines. They were filled with observations about each child's unique needs, detailed notes about their development, and strategies for helping them through difficult times. The security tablet suddenly lit up with multiple alerts. The cameras showed Margaret's form moving through the house, more clearly than ever before. She paused at each journal, her cool presence leaving slight impressions on the pages as if she too was revisiting her life's work. Sarah watched as Margaret's form settled into her familiar rocking chair. For the first time, the thermal imaging was clear enough to show detailed features: the kind eyes, the gentle smile, the caring expression that had comforted generations of children. "I understand now," Sarah said softly. "You're not just watching over Marcus, you're teaching us, Mrs. Chen and me, how to continue your legacy." The temperature in the room shifted to a pleasant coolness, and Sarah heard the faint sound of pages turning. Looking down, she saw that one of the journals had opened to a particular entry. The greatest gift we can give children is not just our presence, but our complete dedication to their well-being. Sometimes, love is so strong, it extends beyond our earthly limits. As Sarah closed the journals for the night, she realized that her house had become more than a home. It was a bridge between past and present, where 3 generations of caregivers worked together to create something extraordinary. A place where love and protection never ended, and where the true meaning of childcare lived on through both the living and the spiritual. 1 year after the discovery of Margaret's presence, the Thompson house had transformed into something truly special. The once mysterious cold spots and unexplained events had become welcome signs of their guardian's attention, and the security cameras now served more as a way to document their unique family dynamic than as tools of investigation. On the anniversary of Mrs. Chen's first day, Sarah organized a small gathering in the garden. She invited the former residents of the house, the children Margaret had cared for who were now adults with their own families. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people wanted to come and share their memories of the beloved nanny. The day of the gathering dawned bright and clear. The garden, now full of Margaret's favorite flowers, provided the perfect setting. Mrs. Chen had helped Marcus make hand-drawn invitations, and the security cameras showed Margaret's form moving excitedly through the house as guests began to arrive. "I remember when Margaret taught me to tie my shoes right here on these steps," one elderly gentleman said, touching the front porch railing fondly. "She used to sing to us during thunderstorms," another guest recalled, "right there in that rocking chair." As people shared their stories, Sarah noticed something extraordinary on her tablet. The thermal imaging showed Margaret's presence moving from person to person, lingering near each of her former charges as they spoke about her. The temperature would drop slightly, and people would unconsciously smile or touch their shoulders, as if feeling her gentle pat of approval. Marcus moved through the crowd, collecting stories about Margaret in a special notebook Mrs. Chen had given him. The security cameras captured a beautiful moment when he sat on the porch steps, surrounded by Margaret's former children, all of them teaching him the lullaby she used to sing. "She's still here, isn't she?" one of the older women asked Sarah quietly. "I can feel her, just like when I was little." Sarah nodded, showing her the thermal imaging. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she watched Margaret's form moving through the garden she had loved so much. As the afternoon progressed, Mrs. Chen gathered everyone for a special ceremony. She had discovered one of Margaret's old traditions, planting a new flower for each child she cared for. Together, they planted a lily for Marcus, while the thermal imaging showed Margaret's form kneeling beside them, her cool presence making the flower's petals dance. That evening, after the guests had left, Sarah found Marcus in his room, looking through his notebook of stories. The security tablet showed Margaret's form sitting beside him, while Mrs. Chen tittied up nearby. "Mom," Marcus said, looking up thoughtfully, "all those people were Margaret's children, right?" "In a way, yes," Sarah replied. "She cared for them like they were her own." "Then we're all one big family," he concluded, "because she takes care of me too." The security system captured the moment perfectly. Margaret's form brightening, the temperature warming slightly, and Mrs. Chen wiping away a tear as she arranged Marcus's toys. Later that night, Sarah added her own entry to Margaret's journals, which had become a continuing record of their unique household. Today we celebrated not just a nanny, but a woman whose love for children created a legacy that continues beyond life itself. In our house, the boundaries between past and present, between the physical and spiritual, have dissolved into something beautiful. Margaret Williams never had children of her own, but she created a family that spans generations, connected by her endless dedication to nurturing and protecting the children in her care. As she wrote, the security tablet showed Margaret's form settling into her rocking chair, the gentle motion as familiar and comforting as ever. Mrs. Chen, who had stayed late to help clean up, sat nearby, knitting a new sweater for Marcus. The thermal imaging captured all 3 caregivers, past, present, and parent, united in their dedication to one small boy and the enduring power of love. The mystery of the 5 nannies who had quit had led them to discover something far more valuable than an explanation. They had found that sometimes the best care comes from an unexpected combination of the living and the eternal, and that true love for children never really ends. it just takes on new forms. And in the Thompson house, under the watchful eye of their guardian angel nanny, that love would continue to grow, nurturing generations to come.